The number one question, I would argue, for counterterrorism professionals in the United States, the United Kingdom, all around the world, is the topic that we're tackling in this session, defeating ISIL. To moderate this session, we're very pleased to have with us Mark Urban, the diplomatic and defense editor for the BBC. Beforehand, he was the defense correspondent for The Independent. He's also been Newsnight's diplomatic editor. And his most recent book is Task Force Black, The Explosive True Story of the SAS and the Secret War in Iraq, which was published in February of 2010. Please join me in welcoming Mark Urban, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you very much, and good morning. We'll push on, because I know timekeeping is always tight on these things. We are extraordinarily lucky this morning to have two key figures, Bret McGurk and Didier Bret, in the struggle against ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, call it what you will. Both diplomats, but both now in central roles in this particular fight. We will ask them to make initial statements of where they see the situation today. I will ask a couple of questions, and then I will do my very best to give you the chance to ask some questions as well. So we're going to start by asking Ambassador Bret to give us an overview from the intelligence perspective. He now oversees the French intelligence establishment and can give us some great insights into what he thinks is the real state of Daesh today.
Quite challenging. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. Apologize if I be a bit depressing in such a beautiful sunny day, talking about Daesh at 9 a.m. in the morning. That's a great honor we make them. So, make a long story short, three key remarks. First, one should acknowledge that this is, that has been said very often, but it's true, and it's still true, it is an unprecedented threat for at least 4 or 5 reasons. The first, as you know, the scale of the theater, as vast as Great Britain, with 10 million people. This is the first time we have to fight against such an entity as large. We have, that's what we know, at least 30,000 fighters, relatively well trained, and among them 50% are foreigners. So I'll come back on this very dimension. They have acquired their work, and they happen to be quite good at that. They have an arsenal of weapons, which is for great dimension, and they might use unconventional weapons as well. So it's another dimension, another level of the threat. And they are all in all very well skilled, not only to make war, but they have extremely clever people in their intelligence service. But what really changed from Al-Qaeda area for us, I mean, from our perspective in Europe, first of all, this is the very border of Europe, what is happening in Syria and Iraq. Turkey is our external border. So we are part of this conflict. It's not something very far from us like Afghanistan, I mean, at least to the public opinion perception. Syria, Iraq, Syria mainly, Libya, 200-something kilometers from Italy. This is part of our world. And those people, I refer to foreign fighters, are coming from countries that are quite close to us. Tunisia, which is one of the biggest reserve of volunteers, Morocco, not mentioning Libya, they are part of our day-to-day life. I mean, we have 5 to 8 million people coming from those 2 or 3 countries I just referred to, including Algeria in France. So this is not kind of a war, you know, that is very far from us. It is our war, if I can say. So that's first the difference from Al-Qaeda. The second one is the first, I would say, 3.0 war. This is something we didn't expect. They are extremely clever the way they use and maximize the potential of internet, the social website. in a very differential kind of a word, way to address all kind of public. They may circulate very broad message, but they can address very narrow type of population. They are extremely good at that. And their communication is rather sophisticated all in all. And as I said, this is a war, and this is not a war. This is a war because at the end of the day, we have to defeat them, and I'll come back on this. But this is not a war in the sense that at home, the domestic dimension is more social. We don't have enemies in France in the sense that they are coming from nowhere, and we have to, no, we know them. There are people who have grown in France. Majority of them were born in France, so they are the second or third generation. And when you go deep in the profile of those people, you understand many other aspects of our day-to-day life. So this is not a war type, I mean, that you can win within a couple of years or in 5 years. This has to be a long-term investment for my country to defeat, but more than that, to integrate those people who have obviously a problem with our country. They challenge it. Anyway, ISIS or ISIL or Daesh will be defeated. I have no doubt. And I'll give you just few signs before I conclude of rather good sign. The first, as you know, they are losing ground. Over the last 2-3 months, they lost Palmyra, which is not a small thing. I mean, that was the last military victory of large scale. They lost on the 27th of March. They lost Shadadi, which is on 5th February, which like Sinjar and Ramadi are main strategic victories for us because it prevents them to move from one capital to the other one, from Raqqa to Mosul. So it's really disturbing the way they've been conducting so far the war. So that are very good news. I don't refer or come back to Kobané, that's old story, but nevertheless we should remember that 1 year ago people even doubted that it would be even feasible to take over the Kobané city. And of course, most important, they are running short of money. That's for sure. We have obvious evidence, intelligence of that. All kind of strikes, starting with the coalition. We have been criticized for doing things that were of few impact. We can see now, we can measure that it's not true. All trucks, all plants, everything that has been main targets, not mentioned in headquarters, training camps, it had a tremendous impact on their finances. They are paying, as you know, half less than 6 months ago their troops. So people start, leaving those countries. We can measure it. We are a lot of French people who are coming back. So it's another challenge, of course, but we can see that they are coming back. That means they feel like it's not, like at the beginning, they promised al-Baghdadi promised that they will get their ultimate war in Dabik. Well, they will defeat the Croisés. Actually, Dabik is going to be soon the next target. So they will have a small communication challenge there. How they will justify that they are losing what was supposed to be the symbolic key elements. And last point, and maybe we could discuss that, nevertheless, one should not forget that will take time. We may have a military victory within a year or a couple of years, that for no doubt, but doesn't mean that will set up peace in this region for at least two main reasons. The first reason is that, on the average, we've seen that in this kind of conflict in the Middle East, it takes at least 5 to 10 years to stabilize things. I mean, to make people, get all together and have a sense of finding out a consensus and trying to find and to set up democratic institutions. So we have been already through a 5 years period almost war. I think one have to be serious about that. It will take another 5 years to stabilize the thing. And the second critical element, but I'm sure Bret will elaborate on that, this is a multi-dimensional crisis. This is the first regional world war. It's a proxy war. We have all key players deeply involved, and involved in the way that they feel like they are playing, what is at stake is it's their own survie, Survival, yeah. That's what is at stake for Ankara, for Riyadh, for Moscow, not mentioning Tehran. So what is at stake is much bigger than simply a fight among people in Syria and Iraq. And then, for sure, no peace on the long run if we can't find the proper political transition in Syria. And that means, what do we do with Bashar al-Assad? This is a key element of the outcome. Second one, Iraq, no peace if no national reconciliation. We know that by heart. That means rather Daesh than the militia, Shia militia or paramilitia, so that's for sure. So reconciliation is the key pillar for a long truce in Iraq. And then no durable peace in this very region if we can prevent seriously another war in Libya, which would be of a totally different dimension. And if we let Libya become a safe harbor for Daesh, this is going to be really, really hard for us to correct that on the long run. I've been in all countries in the neighborhood. I spent a lot of time some time in Tunisia. And I can tell you that we were that close to a major catastrophe when the guys came from Sabrata to Garden. There was a strong military reaction from the Tunisian army. But who knows, next time, how that may come out. So I conclude there.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I mean, we do get a sense from what you've just told us, Didier, of progress. And one hears the US administration talking about moving from a phase of degrading Islamic State to destruction. Now, I don't know how far you'll address that, Bret McGurk, but it would be great if you could give us an overview of where you feel the fight has got to and where you think it's going in the coming months.
Thank you. I think I'll be fairly brief, but it's interesting, those of us working on this every day, we tend to actually describe it the same way. Unprecedented threat. So foreign fighters is something we're all obviously tracking. The numbers now about 40,000 from 100 countries or so. Never seen anything like that before. Depending on who's counting what happened in the 80s, it's about twice as many that went into Afghanistan of this kind of ideological jihadi mindset. And we know what that led to. We think the numbers are down, but still, it's an extraordinary number. Also, for all the reasons that we just heard in terms of their territorial, seeking territorial expansion, controlling millions of people, we've just never seen something like this. So how do we even wrap our heads around it? And just in terms of how we analyze it, there's really 3 dimensions to the ISIL challenge. One is the core in Iraq and Syria. And the core is critical because their entire ideology, how they recruit, their entire narrative is one, the words they use, retain and expand. It is a historic movement, it is expanding, it is constantly growing, and that is something that led to the explosive growth that we saw, particularly in 2013 through 2015. So I've been all around the world, and we hear this everywhere. What is driving so many of your young people to go into Iraq and Syria. And one of the common denominator is this sense of being a part of this phony, but the way they describe it is historic caliphate. So we have to shrink it, and to show that it's actually not expanding, it's shrinking, and it is shrinking. I can go through all the statistics and details, and it'll continue to shrink. So that's the core in Iraq and Syria, and that's really a fundamental core priority of our focus, obviously. Then there are the global networks. There's the foreign fighter networks, there's the financial networks, and there's the propaganda networks. And to do that, that is truly a global challenge. And that's why we have built this global coalition with 66 partners all around the world. To break it down, when it comes to foreign fighters, we have a Chapter 7 UN Security Council resolution calling on all member states to pass laws against foreign fighters, to trade information, to share intelligence information. This is something that is exceedingly difficult. It is much better now than it was when I first started doing this a couple years ago, but still it's not good enough. But we do have global attention, global focus on this. The financial networks, in terms of money coming in, we think we have actually pretty much sliced that off. Daesh is now basically self-funding its operations from within Iraq and Syria, and based on the intelligence we have now, we are really going after that to a pretty decisive effect. As many of you know, we've talked about this before, but we have special operations teams operating that do raise from time to time when we have an opportunity. One of the most significant was about a year ago against the #1 financier of Daesh, deputy to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, named Abu Sayyaf. That was a raid actually right into the heart of Syria, right into the heart at the time of their caliphate, and it happened to be near Shadadi. Shadadi was a citadel for Daesh. We know that's where Baghdadi was based for a while. That is where we picked up Abu Sayyaf, or killed Abu Sayyaf, picked up some of his people, learned more about Daesh than we ever could have imagined. We picked up more information off that site than any such operation in the history of our special forces. We learned about their financing, we learned about how they move money around, we learned about their oil, and now we've been targeting them. That then gets fed into military channels, and we've been targeting them to pretty decisive effect. In Mosul, we found out where they're storing all their money. Hundreds of millions, we think actually in the billion-dollar range, and we have targeted all that. They no longer have those funds to pay their fighters. So financing, we are going after them. On the counter-messaging, the counter-messaging now is completely different than it was even 6 months ago. And all you have to do is just look at what Daesh, how they're describing themselves. They are no longer saying, and they think of them, it's a war, as they describe it, of flags. And they used to have these maps of the flags continuing, expanding all the way to Rome and continuing to grow. Now they're very defensive. They're explaining why they're losing, saying that they're being tested. This is part of the challenge. It's a very different narrative that they are putting out. And then we are also, of course, working globally with partners in the Gulf. The UAE is a 24/7 counter-messaging center. We also have a very good program here in London, getting at the different streams of messaging. There's a religious-based messaging that our Islamic partners can do, and obviously we can't do. There's also the messaging and how they appeal to many, particularly here in the UK and France and elsewhere, of again joining this historic movement. And you can just watch what they put out. It's sun-drenched scenes of children eating ice cream cones, and you can come and kind of be part of this glorious thing. We have been countering that quite aggressively, and it's actually fairly easy to counter now. So the counter-messaging, we are going after 24/7, and it's starting to make a difference. The foreign fighter numbers, as I mentioned, are lower, and even in their own propaganda, they are now telling people, actually don't come into Syria, go to Libya. And that's partially because it's a lot harder to get into Syria, and once these guys get into Syria, it's much harder for them to get out. And we want to make sure, one, they can't get in, and two, once they're in, they're going to die in Iraq or Syria. They're not going to get out. So we think we're making progress there. Finally is the affiliates. They have about 7 or 8 around the world, depending on who's counting, but most of these are pre-existing terrorist groups that now fly the flag of ISIL. So those are pre-existing problems. Those are things that we've already been focused on, and we are still focused on them. We don't want to be too distracted every time some pre-existing terrorist group raises the flag of ISIL. Where we do get concerned, however, is where we see the transfers of money, the transfers of messaging instructions, and the transfers of leaders, and we have definitely seen that in Libya. So we've been focused quite aggressively on Libya. We as the US have not hesitated when we see a threat emerging to take military action. The leaders responsible for the attacks in Tunisia last year, we targeted them near Sabratha quite effectively. We'll continue to do that. We now have a government of national accord on the ground in Tripoli. We have to help that government mature. That'll be quite critical. But Libya is an increasing focus of us. So just again, the way we analyze this, and I think the way to think through it when you're looking at what we're doing, is the core in Iraq and Syria, and that is shrinking their territorial, their ability to control territory. It has shrunk quite a bit, about 45% in Iraq. In Syria, much of their strategic ground, the entire border with Turkey east of the Euphrates now is gone to them. All of their connections between Raqqa and Mosul now are gone to them. They're forced onto back roads. And the pressure is increasing on Raqqa, but not to, I really can't underestimate the challenges of where we go from here. It's extremely difficult, and every single day is a real struggle, will continue. But we're shrinking their territory. The global networks, foreign fighter, finance, propaganda, every single day we're working on that, not just in Washington, the US, but our partners around the world as part of a coordinated coalition. And then finally, the affiliates, which I think most significantly, of course, we're focused on Libya, but also the Sinai and other affiliates in which they're trying to increase their capacity. So it's a multidimensional threat, as we've heard. It's a global threat. It takes a global coalition to combat it, and we are making some progress now. I think you can see that, but we all recognize it's not fast enough. We want to move as fast as we possibly can, and these threats, we have to all acknowledge, will continue for the foreseeable future, even after we get Daesh out of Mosul, out of Raqqa. This is an ideology. People who are infected with the ideology will still be with us, and it will remain a threat really to all of us. So we have to prepare for a very long effort over the coming years and make sure that what we saw in Afghanistan in the 80s and the outgrowth of that does not happen given what we're seeing now. Because these are a lot of young people. A lot of people have been to Syria and are already back in their homes. A lot of people still being indoctrinated over the internet and trying to go, or simply homegrown based attacks. It's something that will be with us for a long time. But we are now, I think you can really say, and you can see it, making some progress.
Thank you very much. Do you think, Didier, that as progress is made, there is a greater desire on the part of them to stage spectacular terrorist attacks in Europe? How do you evaluate that threat right now? I mean, we saw the tragic events in Paris and Brussels. Do you think that network is effectively countered or rolled up? How many people are still out there? Big questions, I know, but...
Oh, big question, but very easy answer. Yes, definitely. The more efficient we'll be on the ground, the more aggressive they will be all around Europe. This is the easiest fix for them, not to lose face, to be still proactive, to show that there are some, gains, some victories at hand. And they are maybe a bit hesitant on the global strategy. Would they keep on harassing us on small, easy operations, which is one option, or should they rather big-scale operations, which are rather complicated, but due to the geography of Europe, you can have a logistic basis in one country, taking weapons from another one, and decide to strike a third city. So there are still ways and means to organize those large-scale operations. My feeling is that they will do both. They will start keeping the pressure on our capitals at the highest possible level. I have no doubt about that. We all live in open societies. We're not going to change our way to apprehend our lives, reality. We're going to have within 1 month the Euro football championship. We're going to have those fan zones with the 20,000 to 100,000 in Paris Champ de Mars gathering. We're not going to give up. So we're going to do everything that might provide our citizens, our guests, the maximum security. But one should recognize that we're going to have to consent certain level of risk in our life. But I mean, the choice for our political for our government is clear. We're not going to give up the way we live. That will be their victory. So yes, they will try both. They are still, I think, hesitant on the strategy, but they clearly understood that it has to keep on regularly. One capital, another capital. Paris, we know for sure that France is pretty much high as good targets. First, because with the UK and with the American, with the other colleagues, with our partners, we are pretty much in the front of the war against Daesh. So they know that they have to clearly make an effort there. And they know that Paris, like London or Brussels, are very easy as a capital where all medias are present. So it gives them an international audience every time they strike. So they're pretty good at strategy. So yes, they will definitely keep up the pressure on our.
Can I ask you, just in terms of other possible clouds on the horizon or things that might threaten this progress that you've talked about, as the so-called caliphate is shrunk, how concerned are you about militias starting to contest the towns and other places that are freed of the Islamic State, that being a further alienation to Sunni or other people who are in there, and it might help them to stabilize their position if each victory turns into a fight over the spoils between rival militias?
Let me address that in two ways. One with an anecdote, and then just with some facts of what we've seen in Tikrit and now we're seeing in Ramadi. So an anecdote. Before the Kurdish Peshmerga launched the operation to retake Sinjar, and of course Sinjar is where a lot of this, we've been tracking this for many years, but Sinjar is where a lot of this broke onto the international stage, Sinjar Mountain and the Yazidis. So it took a long time to get in place to actually retake Sinjar from ISIL, and very significant moment. And I was in northern Iraq, and we spoke with a very senior Peshmerga leader who had been on the front lines talking about what's going to come. And I asked this very question. I said, one thing we want to try to make sure, and we're working on this very aggressively, is that post-Daesh in Sinjar, we don't see retaliation and tit-for-tat attacks. As you can imagine psychologically what the events of that, what had happened in Sinjar, just the scars, which will be with people obviously for the rest of their lives. And he told me, they were very focused on it, and he told me he had a meeting with a number of Yazidis who were going to take part in the operation, and an elderly man who stood up, and the Peshmerga were trying to say, we have to, once we get Daesh out, we want to make sure that the Arab families who are there are treated fairly. And this elderly Yazidi said to him, they took my wife, they took my daughters, they took my mother, and he said, all I have left in my life is my revenge against these people. And that is a deep, especially when you're in Iraq, you can feel it. And in the events of the summer of 2014, and I was there at the time, when Daesh breaks through Mosul, they're pouring down the Tigris Valley, they break through at Al-Qaim, in the Euphrates Valley, that looks like they're rolling towards Baghdad, they're announcing we're coming for Karbala, they're killing thousands of people and putting it up on YouTube just outside of Tikrit. And the psychological impact of that, of those days, is so deeply woven now in the communities, particularly in Iraq and also in Syria. So you can never completely eliminate what you're talking about. The lawlessness, the tit-for-tat, revenge-type events. We've worked extremely hard, first of all, for zero tolerance for that, and also to help build up the legitimate security forces to provide law and order afterwards. Again, it's impossible to be perfect in this regard, but Tikrit was a test case. The Tikrit operation began, the liberation of Tikrit from Daesh, it actually began by popular mobilization forces, and some of the popular mobilization forces known as the Shia militias, which are not responsive to the authority of the central government at Baghdad. And that was a major problem because a lot of those groups are not controllable. They pretty much bogged down, and when we came in to help, it was Iraqi security forces that ultimately liberated Tikrit. We had problems immediately after Tikrit. But then we worked very hard, and I have to give the governor of Baghdad real credit for this, and the new Prime Minister Abadi, who has one of the hardest jobs in the world. His philosophy is more decentralization, more empowering the local leaders at the grassroots. And so, working over a series of weeks, we pretty much got the militias at least out of the streets of Tikrit. Through the coalition, we flooded Tikrit with what we call stabilization funding. We have a pretty revolutionary program run through the Iraqi government and the UN to get lights on, get the basic conditions for people to come back to their homes. Tikrit, of course, is an iconic Sunni city in the heart of Saladin province, and we now have, according to the UN zone numbers, about 95% of the population has returned to Tikrit. Life has come back to the city. Tikritis, local police are in charge of security in the streets. The university is open again. Again, nothing is perfect there, but that's pretty good. If you look on this map of where are people actually returning to their homes, it's actually happening in Iraq. So Tikrit is Exhibit A. Now in Anbar, again, something that a lot of analysts said couldn't be done about 6 months ago, we're actually now retaking all of the Euphrates Valley from ISIL. Ramadi has been retaken, and the Iraqi forces, importantly, to your question, working with the local tribes of Anbar province. The tribes are interwoven into these operations now. They just liberated the town of Heat, which is between Haditha and Ramadi if you go up the Euphrates Valley. And Heat was, again, a stronghold of ISIL in the Euphrates Valley. It was retaken by Iraqi security forces and local tribes. So now in Ramadi, we're focused on, again, keeping kind of elements not responsive to the state out and getting people back to their homes. This is difficult because as ISIL leaves a place, they put IEDs into homes and into refrigerators, and it's extremely dangerous. We have a program about $15 million with counter-IED, some of the best companies in the world, working with the UN and working with the Iraqis to clean the streets of these landmines and IEDs. And we have about 60,000 people have now come back to Ramadi. The Iraqis want to modulate that because it's still very dangerous given the IED threat, but people are coming back to their homes. So the underlying philosophy is that post-Daesh, it should be local people in charge of their own security. It should not be people from the outside, and Tikrit has been a model for that, and Anbar province right now is a model for that. You just can't underestimate the challenges here and the fact that even post-Daesh, post-ISIL, you're still going these are fairly violent places. There's not going to be rainbows and kind of peace breaking out everywhere. We can defeat and we will defeat this transnational terrorist movement, which is a threat to all of us. And then it'll be the post-ISIL phase, which will be just as challenging, but a different challenge, and not so much a challenge that directly threatens us in our capitals.
Okay, thank you so much. We have time for questions, not a huge amount of time, but we'll just try and keep it as quick fire as possible. John Scarlett.
You said
yes, there's a microphone making its way.
when you were talking about numbers, so I think, Didier, you said there were 40. It had got up to 40,000, or one of you said it got up to 40,000, but they were coming down. Now, given what you are saying and how they're reacting defensively, as you describe, and therefore the ever-expanding, caliphate is a different story, are we seeing that reflected in numbers of fighters and foreign fighters and volunteers coming in, going down? Because up until now, the picture that has been presented constantly is the other way around.
From the figures I've got from all around European capitals, it's getting down. I mean, people are less inclined to get there because they got a feeling that it's not going that well. Nevertheless, we've got almost 700 to 800 French citizens, for instance, who got there. We got equivalent of people who are still trying, to move back and forth. So those are huge numbers for us, the same for the Belgium. But all in all, we feel like it's getting in the right direction, and we are better at keeping our own citizens at home as well. And the cooperation with the Turkish government is better and better. They are more cooperative, and they are really trying their utmost to help us to control the flow of people.
Bret, did you want to come in on that, or you?
No, again, we also see the same trend. It's definitely gone down. We have about 140 Americans have gone to Syria. I think my colleague Lisa Monaco will be here later today. Obviously, we track this very closely on the counterterrorism side. So the trend lines, which were all going the wrong way, now are going the right way. But that's, again, not to, we can never underestimate the significance of this threat, which is going to continue.
Okay, thank you very much. The gentleman there, and then Richard Barrett.
Sure. David Sanger from the New York Times. Good to see you again. Yesterday at one of the panels, we were discussing the question of the degree to which it was possible with a group like ISIL to disrupt their command and control through cyber means, through non-kinetic means, which you've heard the President, the Secretary of Defense, others discuss in recent times. And yet that seems to be a relatively small part of what was otherwise looks like, from your description, a fairly traditional kind of counterterrorism effort. So can you tell us what's new and different when you compare this to, say, what you were doing with Al-Qaeda, which was a different kind of threat group a few years ago?
Thanks, David. I think we actually are doing quite a bit on the cyber piece. We obviously don't talk about everything that we're doing. But look, we're now striking a leader of ISIL about every 3 days. And we're increasingly either picking up or killing some of their bigger fish. Just recently, Haji Imam, who is another deputy to Baghdadi, a very sophisticated, well-known terrorist. After Shaddadi, Omar Shishani, their overall war emir. So we're actually deep now inside the network and beginning to unravel it. You said something very important up front about their kind of command and control. What we've been trying to do when we first drew this up, it was degrade. That's the key word, because we want to degrade their warfighting capacity. That means their command and control, their ability to mass and maneuver force, their ability to move around the battle space. And that was what makes it different than Al-Qaeda. It really was operating as a conventional army and as a quasi-state. So it is a very different, it's not just a CT. There's a CT component, but it's also more just conventional warfare of trying to make sure that they cannot maneuver like an army and retake all this territory. So we've greatly degraded that. But we've had some success against networks like Al-Qaeda, so those tools we're very much applying to Daesh. So I don't think it's so much different. On the kind of high-end counterterrorism, what we're doing is very similar to the way we target Al-Qaeda networks around the world. The external plotting network, and it is a network, it is run out of parts of Syria, and we are doing everything we can to learn about it, to find out who they are, to make sure that people can't travel, and to target the leaders. So the kind of counterterrorism dimension of the counter-ISIL campaign is very close to the way we deal with Al-Qaeda. But what's different about Daesh is it's a quasi-state-like entity with millions of people under its domain, and that's why it also has a conventional warfare piece.
If you allow me on this cyber side of the war, fully concur with what Bret just said, but I think we'll have to rely as well on our civil societies. That will be a powerful tool at our disposal to defeat them. It's not just a matter of government counterterrorism, it's as well our capacity to mobilize all our strength, including our community managers, and there are a lot of skills in our countries who are capable on their ground to defeat them. And I think in counter-propaganda, it can't be only the government action. We do really have to be supported by a larger number of communities, and including Muslim communities.
We are out of time, but being a terrible broadcasting faux pas, I will carry on for another few minutes because I can see there's still quite a few people who want to ask questions. So what we'll do is we'll take 3 quick-fire questions. John Gearson first.
Thanks very much. Drawing on something I raised yesterday, much of the mobilization that you've been talking about, we were told, was not from the body of people who were persons of interest just 10 years before, i.e. a surprise, a new mobilization. It's a bit unfair because you're talking about ISIL, but how confident can we be that we're not going to face the next threat? I mean, are we thinking about how we are going to deal with terrorism and the incidence of it rather than defeating each challenge as it comes along?
So that's the next wave. Then the gentleman there.
Yeah, hi, Duncan Gardner. I think James Comey said on Thursday that he believed there might be some lessons to be learnt from the attacks in France and Brussels over the last few months. And I just wanted to ask Didier really what he thought those lessons were likely to be.
Okay. Richard, do you want to? One last one here, and then we'll try and canter through those. They're all counter-terrorist focused at the moment. So
yeah, thank you, and so is mine, I'm afraid.
Good.
I noticed a recent study by Will McCants, who's a well-respected scholar of Islamic State, that pointed out that the most common shared characteristic between people who've been involved in terrorist attacks over the last few years was that they were francophone. And I was quite surprised by that. But thinking back to the address that Mohammed Adnani made in November 2014 when he encouraged Islamic State supporters to go out and attack foreign people, he was particularly discourteous towards the French. And I wondered if you saw any significance in that.
Okay. 3 quick questions there. Obviously, I think...
No, Francophonie has nothing to do with the potential of being a terrorist or a criminal or whatever. There is no essentialism, like you speak English, you might be this way, you speak French. No, it's just that for historic reasons, as you know very well, the Maghreb and part of the Mashrek and Middle East has extremely close ties with France. So it happens that they speak French. And it happens that the Muslim Arabic world is, in turmoil. So the conclusion is, yes, part of those people who speak French, they happen to be part of this mess. So, but I don't think one can say, if you learn French, if you speak French, you have more chance to become a terrorist. I don't think. If it is the case, I'm ready to give up speaking French. And on the lessons drawn on, yes, this is my daily headache. How can we scale up our all capacities, our legal framework, everything that can prevent, deter, and stop this threat? And this is the same for my British colleagues, my dear Paddy McGuinness here, and everybody around those tables. I mean, yes, we are doing it. Just to give you a small, anecdotic example, before I took over my duty, it was more overseas that we had to strike and fight against the terrorism, and the threat was more outside than in our countries. And at that time, we had like what was called Conseil National du Renseignement in France, I think the highest council where we talk about that. It was like one every 2 years when we gather at the level of the president. Right now, it's every 3 months. So we're taking stock of every decision we take. We're trying to make some benchmarking to see how efficient it is, what next step on all sides, fight against the financing, our legislation, cooperation is a key element between partners within EU framework, so we are doing it on a daily basis, yes.
Can I ask you for a final word on lessons learned from Paris and Brussels, but also the John Gearson point, the new waves? I think in part you were addressing that through Libya, but is this going to be a recurring phenomenon?
The new, like I think we are within our coalition. We were just in Riyadh. I think we have very frank conversations with our like-minded partners, with others. Look, beyond Daesh, there's a strain of thought within the Islamic world that has to be addressed by the Islamic world, and that's something that I think our Islamic partners are very focused on. That was a big topic of our discussions, of course, in Riyadh with the GCC, but it's very dangerous, and it's something that has to be addressed by our partners, particularly in the Gulf and particularly Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis are now doing quite a bit because ISIL is a threat to Saudi Arabia. There's been a number of attacks in Saudi Arabia, including one just about 2 weeks ago. So that was a main topic of conversation with the president and our partners in the GCC. From Brussels and Paris, one of the lessons is the sophistication of the external attack plotting network, and something that was just, for me, particularly surprising. We knew one of the main external, the way they have their network, they have external plotters who are planning attacks in different parts of the world. That's kind of how they do it, and then we try to act accordingly, make sure that that can't happen. But one of their terrorists named Abaoud was the head of their external plotting in Europe. And after the Paris attacks, we figured obviously he was probably one of the planners, but he was based in Raqqa, and we've been trying to find him for some time. It turned out he actually traveled from Syria to Paris to oversee the attacks. It's something I don't think we've really seen before, where one of the main planners, one of the more sophisticated guys, actually travels to the site of the attack to oversee the attack. And thanks to the great work of our colleagues in France, he's no longer around, and we're breaking up that network. But it's a sophisticated network. It's based in Syria. It's not new. Go back to what Baghdadi was saying 3-4 years ago, but go back to what Zarqawi used to say, the kind of first kernel of this thought. They want to attack us at home. It is part of their core to their ideology, and we have to make sure that doesn't happen. However, given the sophisticated network, which is global, this is going to be with us. But what we want to be able to do is degrade that network which is coming out of Syria, which leads to the more spectacular type atrocities that we've seen in Paris and Brussels. The one-off attacks like we saw in San Bernardino, the people who are just indoctrinated over the internet, that's something that will take civil society, will take all of us kind of banding together to try to make sure that we are able to identify people before they are indoctrinated and try to prevent those types of attacks. But just the lesson learned, sophistication of the external attack plotting network. We knew it was sophisticated, but we now know more about it than we have ever before. And now it's up to our intelligence services cooperating with our counterterrorism professionals, and you'll hear from some of them, I know, later today, about degrading and unraveling the network.
Thank you so much. We are really out of time now, so I hope you'll all join me in thanking them both for a fabulous presentation.